Okay, awesome. Thank you everyone so much for being here and joining us for our final webinar of our winter webinar series. Now I'm going to start things off with a presentation from Anna Turbelin on the biology and cold tolerance of the spotted lanternfly. And as a research scientist at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre with Natural Resources Canada and Sault Ste. Marie, her research focuses on invasive science, particularly cold tolerance of invasive insects such as the spotted lanternfly, as well as cascading effects and synergies between biological invasions and natural hazards. She holds a PhD in physical geography from King's College London and previously conducted postdoctoral research at Université Paris-Saclay on projects pertaining to invasive science, including InvaCost and AlienScenarios. So, Anna, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, and I'll pass things off to you after I stop sharing.
Hi, good morning. I'll just share my screen with you. So thank you, Chris, for having me on this talk today. I will be talking to you about the cold tolerance of spotted lanternfly, where it's work that I've been doing with Amanda Rowe, based here in the zoo. First, I would like to start by thanking our funding agency, so the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Surge International, but also all our collaborators and technical support for the work that we've been doing, as well the Invasive Species Centre. And I don't know if you can see my mouse. I think I can put it laser pointer. There we go. For those lovely icons that you can see. I also want to put out a little disclaimer that I've been using some AI generated images, but I'm sure you'll be able to spot them in the talk. First, I will give you a bit of background on the spotted lanternfly, and then I will talk about the cold tolerance work that we have been doing and the implications for Canada. So background, spotted lanternfly is Lycorma delicatula. In French is the Fulgor tacheté. It's a planthopper native to China and southeastern Asia, and is currently invasive in North America, but also Korea and Japan. It's going the wrong way. The life cycle of spotted lanternfly, you can see adults around July to December. They lay eggs between September and December. The egg masses, you can see them between September to June. And then May to July, you'll see first to third instance nymphs. They are black with white spots. July to September, you'll see fourth instance nymphs that are black and red with white spots. Now, these are based on Pennsylvania timeline. So if you're further south, like Nashville, the dates may be a bit earlier, and you're further north, it could like shift a little bit. Now, for the talk, what's relevant here is that egg masses are the overwintering stage of spotted lanternfly. And this is what we have been working on, and they're late in the late summer, early fall. So usually by the fall equinox. They are covered in a waxy coating that gives them some form of protection, and you can see them on trees or different form of surfaces. So adults usually accumulate on trees by the nodes of branches, and they can take over the whole tree. So you can see small gatherings, but also all over the tree. It's not unusual to see different life forms on a host plant. So here you can see fourth instars and adults. They suck, so they're a phlegm feeder. They suck sap from the stem of the trees and from branches. Their waste products promotes mold growth, so also attracts all sorts of other insects and further damages trees and plants. Yeah, that's how they suck the sap from. They have a wide range of hosts. They feed on over 70 species of plants, including important trees in Canada, like maple, walnut, and willow. The main host is the tree of heaven, which is also an invasive plant here in Canada and in the US from Asia. The nymph's host range is exceptionally broad and narrows down for adults. Importantly, it is a threat to agricultural communities because it loves to feed on grapes, on vine trees, on hops. As Mandaro, my co-author, well, not co-author, my collaborator would say, it's a fun killer. It destroys all the fun things that you get. It is a phytosanitary concern in forestry. And also important, it's not limited by tree of heaven, so it can survive without it. In the US, it was first discovered in Pennsylvania in 2014, and since then it has spread outside of quarantine zone, further north, but also further south. And it currently has infestations in 19 different states. And it has spread quite far north, so you can see there's, as of 2026, there's multiple infestations around the Great Lakes area. Naturally, it's more of a slow spreader, but it lays its eggs on smooth surfaces, like I said, pretty much anywhere. And it's a great hitchhiker. So it will spread long distances via human-assisted transportation, like cars, but also ships and trucks and trains and so on. It follows the rail line pretty well. There are models that predicts the spread, especially in the USA. It is predicted to reach California by 2023. All of these models to date, because I think there's a recent publication that have actually used our data, used data from physiological data from South Korea, which gives you certain, well, different limits than what we have found to make their prediction for spread, which is, yeah, what you see here. So like I said, they use data from South Korea, but what we don't know really if the lower temperature limits in North America are comparable to the ones that you get in South Korea. Which leads us to the work that we did. Really, the question that we had was, can spotted lanternfly survive winter in Canada? And some models says it can, but we do know that hatch rate is sensitive to natural winter temperatures, and we don't really know what the thermal limits of spotted lanternfly are in North America. So you can see some on some of those models, they get to the south, but the suitability is really low, it's in the blues or the lower conditions. Now, the work that we did, we assessed the cold tolerance strategy. So we wanted to know whether it died from chilled injuries or whether it died from internal ice formation, or even if it survived freezing. So whether it was a freeze-tolerant species. And we also look at the lower thermal limits, which was really to try and see at what temperature does it die. We got eggs. We collected eggs from Pennsylvania. They were sent to us. They were acclimatized in the field, sent to us in December, and we left them in our insect production quarantine facilities in a cold chamber until the peak of winter. So we timed our experiments with winter and exposed them to different treatment temperatures. Well, from then. Before running our experiments, we did do some preliminary work, which was to measure the supercooling points of egg masses, and they ranged between minus 17.4 and minus 27.7. This was really to give us a bracket as to where we should set our lower thermal, our temperatures for the lower thermal experiments. Now, for the cold strategy, like I said, we wanted to see if freeze would kill them or not. And we found that they were chill susceptible. So the eggs failed to hatch near the supercooling point at minus 24, roughly minus 24.8. That means that they die before freezing, but they die at really quite low, around that temperature. What we did there, we had half of the eggs that were frozen and half of the eggs that did not freeze, and they were subjected to the same temperatures, and then no one hatched. Because of that, we wanted to see what temperatures would actually kill them. And we did different treatments. We used short-term treatments, 1 hour, 12 hours, and also long-term exposure treatments, 10 days, 15 days. The temperatures range between 0 and minus 25. And then we had egg masses that were not exposed that stayed in our chamber at 6 degrees. That's 22 treatments. And what we found is actually we got hatch in 18 out of our 22 treatments. And importantly, we had hatch in our minus 25 exposure at 1 hour, which means we didn't really find a short-term temperature at which it would die. And that's like lower than it was before. One of the egg masses actually nearly had 100% hatch in one of those masses. And another important value is that we had a hatch at our treatment that was that lasted 10 days at minus 20. Now, the highest hatch rate was in our minus 10 treatment for 10 days, and it wasn't really different from a hatch rate of egg masses that were not exposed to any cold. Now, you can see here the temperatures where they were actually significantly impacted. So in the short exposure treatments, they were significantly impacted at or below minus 20. And in the long exposure treatments, so 10 days, 15 days, they were impacted at or below minus 15. Now, what this shows is that they did survive actually temperatures near the supercooling point. The lowest one we observed was minus 27.7. And based on that, we suggested that it was a conservative approximation of the lower thermal limit temperature for the egg masses for that species. And overall, when we compared back to the populations in South Korea, actually, the population in the USA could tolerate temperatures at least 5 degrees colder, which is quite significant. Now, there are things to consider when you look at all those differences and the work that we did. Importantly, we kept our egg masses in a laboratory setting and at a constant temperature. Now, we were unsure what the impact of fluctuating temperatures could be, so we ran more experiments in the field this time. We didn't collect. We set traps in Chicago, Nashville, and we also got egg masses from Westport, Connecticut. And as you can see, we picked those locations because they experience quite different winters, and these are the edges of the range we'll see in the US, with Westport being an intermediate point. When you compare winter, actually days below at sub-zero temperatures, Illinois had 33 days, Tennessee only 3. Days where the minimum temperature was below minus 10, Illinois had 20 days, Tennessee 8. Freeze-thaw events, actually Illinois had fewer, that was 51, and Tennessee 60. And when you look at the amplitude, so the difference between the maximum and minimum temperatures in a day, the differences were a lot higher in Tennessee than in Illinois. Now, bearing this information in mind, we went out and set out traps around the fall equinox in both locations. Westport is slightly different, and I will not be talking about it in this talk, mostly because they were exposed to an artificial fluctuating temperature regime. So for Nashville and Chicago, we set up traps. So yeah, in September, and did a late fall collection around November, December, a winter collection, midwinter collection for that was late January, early February, and an early spring collection for Chicago was in April. Once we sent we sent egg masses back to our facilities again, and we did a range of experiments. First, we looked at the supercooling point. So that's, if you remember, I said actually we couldn't find the limit with our lower lethal limit experiments, but the supercooling point was, in this case, informative for spotted lanternfly. So there we went and measured supercooling points for over 1,600 eggs, which was quite a lot over the whole period. And we also looked at, we reran our lower lethal limit experiment for 1 hour, and the 1 hour exposure, but at a lower temperature, including -30. And we looked at the hatch rate of the remaining eggs that were used in our supercooling point experiment. So for supercooling points, we only removed 16 eggs in each egg masses, and we hatched the remaining eggs. What we found was actually there are ranges. The supercooling point range from -5.1 to -29.7 overall. That's if you include Illinois and Tennessee. The median was -22.5, and really more than 90% of all supercooling points were below -18.3. Now the effect of location and time on supercooling points varied with the season. The strongest that we saw was a difference in early spring, where supercooling points in Chicago were 1.2 degrees cooler than supercooling points in Tennessee. When we look at the hatch rate, we kind of see a different pattern, and you can see it clearly here. The late fall median hatch rate, so that's this box on the left, is a lot lower really than the hatch rate in the spring. So in Tennessee in blue, you can see it's 16% hatch rate, median hatch rate in the late fall, 38% in Illinois. But then egg masses that had spent the whole winter in the field and were collected in the spring had a hatch rate that were a lot higher. So median hatch rate in Chicago was 88%, and median hatch rate in Tennessee was 59%. Now, from the winter data that I showed you, actually it's interesting to consider that the hatch rates in Illinois, that those egg masses were exposed to -20 at least twice throughout winter, whereas Tennessee hadn't. They have a much higher hatch rate. So takeaway points here. We can see some plasticity in cold torrents and probably deacclimation based on the change in supercooling points in Tennessee. There is a significant impact of fluctuating temperatures on survival. No complete mortality at -20. The -20 is a number that is relevant because that's what previous studies from South Korea found, that spotted lanternfly, everyone died at this temperature. However, none of our experiments show that they survive, and as you can see in Chicago, they survive quite well -20 temperatures, which made us suggest that cold could be beneficial to spotted lanternfly. Implications. So what does that mean for Canada? I was just checking on time. Well, is there a risk of incursion? Yes, it's actually quite high. There has been these are images that are from iNaturalist, and you can see they were found on they were incursions in Canada. That was in 2023. There have been more since. So it's really important to stay vigilant and report any sightings to the CFIA. Right now, it would be the egg masses stage, but as the snow melts and the time goes by, you might start seeing nymphs. And then this summer, if you see any adults, yeah, do report them the other way. We just continue with implications. We looked at the minimum temperatures that they would hatch in places where spotted lanternfly had been intercepted by the CFIA, and all those colors, like the orange brownish colors, all this, the events, the recurrence of the events over the last 50 years is more than like once, no, it's less than once a year. So in Montreal, in Montreal, it's every year you'll see it, but actually this is every 2 to 4 years or every 10 years even, which implies that it's unlikely to be limited by cold in these areas. And why it's important? Well, because this is also where all the crops grows in Canada, and it's unlikely to be limited by cold in those areas, especially in the wine region. With this, I want to thank you for listening, and if you spotted lanternfly in Canada, whether it's this summer or before, snap it, catch it, and report it to the CFIA. You can scan this QR code here, and it would lead you to those pages. Yeah, thank you. Oh,
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna. Yeah, not great news. We get cold up here, but not that cold. So not and some of those earlier photos you were sharing, I was like, I'm sure that's AI, but they ended up being actual photos. They really do just cover the whole tree. That's crazy. Yeah, so Alex will be sharing, will be talking to us about leveraging alternative sources of species occurrence for biodiversity and conservation research. And this case study will be on the spotted lanternfly. And specifically, he'll be talking about using Google Trends to track species occurrence of spotted lanternfly. Dr. Alex Van Hoon received his PhD from Leahy University in 2020. He is currently an assistant professor of biology at DeSales University. His research employs multiple approaches for answering fundamental questions in ecology, evolution, and conservation. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to stop sharing and pass things off to you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Let's see, can everyone hear me? Okay, am I coming through? All right.
I can hear you well.
Okay, and we can see my screen as well.
You're looking great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Anna, for the very cool presentation as well. Yeah, so my name is Alex. I'm an assistant professor of biology at DeSales University, and today I'll be talking to you about looking at other sources of occurrence data for species. I'm going to be using the spotted lanternfly as sort of a case study, but I'll try to highlight kind of the importance of this approach generally, and maybe where it can be used in not only the spotted lanternfly, but other invasive species and even other contexts as well. So before I start, I'll just quickly thank the student researchers that worked on this project. I had a few undergraduate students, very talented students that helped out with this work, then also just the DeSales University staff and biology department as well. So starting off, questions in ecology and applications in conservation generally. A lot of these are dependent on knowing where are species, right? Where do they exist in nature? Before you can go out and study them, you have to know where you are looking. This is important for a number of applied areas. So, for example, monitoring at-risk species, so endangered species, for example, as we're talking about today, looking for biological invasive species as well. And then just generally looking for how species on a whole, how populations are changing sort of in a changing world, right? How their ranges are shifting with climate change, how their phenology changes, and then how the larger community composition is changing as well. And so historically, where we got this data from of where do species exist is that there would be trained researchers that would go out in the field and do surveys. And this is what we still do today. And this is super, super important. However, today we have other kinds of data that we can leverage. We are in a world that is in abundance of data. There are large digital data sets that describe pretty much everything in our world. Obviously, there's the kind of scary notion of companies collecting data on you to advertise for you and things like that. However, on a maybe somewhat lighter version, there's a lot of data on just natural populations as well. Right. So how big are populations? Where are they? How are they changing through time? So we have a lot of data on this that come from various sources. There is a sort of new term for the general approach of answering ecology questions using all of this data that we've accumulated. This term is ecology. You can read some papers where this term was coined in the past few years. But overall, ecology basically says we have lots of data sets that are being automatically collected from the public through different outfits, through different companies. These can be important data sources in order for us to gain certain ecological and applied insights. So, for example, what we're talking about today is we can use this data to try to assay how biological invasions are progressing. And so what do these data look like? We're probably familiar with some of these, so things like citizen science initiatives. So I'm sure we've all looked at or heard of iNaturalist before. Anna was showing some occurrences of spotted lanternflies through iNaturalist observations that have made their way up into Canada. So that is one big data set, right? That's not really trained. Well, there are trained researchers that probably use iNaturalist, but by and large, this is a publicly available platform, right? So you can just sort of leverage the general public to try to assay where populations are for you, right? And you can look at that data. Besides that, you can look at things like social media, internet traffic, etc., right? Lots of different avenues, and there's probably ones I'm not even thinking of here, but lots of different avenues that can give you insight into where these populations are existing, how big they are, where they're moving, etc. And so before I go on to the spotted lanternfly, just sort of a brief kind of overall point here. I'm sure at some point we've all kind of been taught this scientific method, which is where you have an observation, you research the area that kind of applies to your question, you come up with a hypothesis, and then specifically kind of the rate limiting step of science historically was testing with experiment, of going out in this case of looking at, for example, where do these species occurrences live, right? That was kind of the most time consuming part, actually doing the test, actually collecting the data. But again, the point I'm trying to make today is that we have a lot of different data sources. And so the rate limiting step kind of becomes analyzing all of this data. And so the case study that obviously I'll be talking about today is with the spotted lanternfly. I was told Anna was going to be presenting first, so I only have one very brief slide to introduce the spotted lanternfly since we just heard so much great information about it. It's a plant hopper, so it's a hemipteran that is native to Asia. It has become an invasive species in several countries, notably the United States, dating back just over a decade ago. It was first detected in Berks County in Pennsylvania back in 2014. It's a phloem feeder, right? So it has certain native plants that it feeds on that are also invasive species here in the Western Hemisphere, but it's also a generalist, right? So it can feed on many different plant species. Notably, this can have negative impacts on natural plant populations, as well as importantly, and for better or for worse, why it's received so much attention is that it also has very negative economic impacts, right, on orchards, vineyards, and things like that. And then as Anna was also talking about, it has a global potential distribution, right? So it's here in the United States right now. Apparently there's some occurrences that have been found in southern Canada. but modeling shows that this species has potential ranges elsewhere where it has not yet been introduced. And so going into my study here, this was first kind of catalyzed by looking at this publication, which came out a few years ago. This is an R package. This is a program package that was published by this group here, a lot of which is out of the Northeast. It's a R package called LiDMAP-R. It is a comprehensive package that has aggregated a bunch of occurrence data for the spotted lanternfly. It's one of the sort of most comprehensive packages you can access publicly. And so what this publication is and what this data set is it is field surveys from state departments. It is field surveys from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it also is leveraging itself some of that citizen science data. So, for example, like digital naturalist observations. This published data set has cleaned this data, kind of standardized it, and you can publicly access this, right? And so you could, for example, look through this data set and see how the spotted lanternfly has sort of spread over time. And I believe this is this package is being updated every year. So it's a yearly occurrence data set. Just looking at this takes a lot of work, right? This takes multiple government bodies, multiple members of the public, and a lot of work by the authors of this paper to sort of aggregate this into a nice map where we can kind of, again, see the invasion history of the spotted lanternfly in the United States. Really cool, really important work. That brings me to sort of a different question. Are there any other ways that we could get a snapshot of where the spotted lanternfly is without having to go through all of that work? Are there alternative, faster ways to monitor species distributions? In this case, the spotted lanternfly, but also just species in general. Again, going back to my original intro, things like at-risk species, other invasive species, all sorts of different contexts. And so what I'll be talking about here or introducing is this tool called Google Trends. I'm sure we've all heard of Google before. This is the most popular internet search engine. It captures a majority of internet searches worldwide, upwards of 90%. And if you've never tried this before, there's a tool that you can use called Google Trends, where you can look at patterns of what the world is Googling, right? And so, for example, you can look at the interest of certain search terms over time. So I have just kind of a couple of silly examples just to illustrate what data Google Trends is returning back to you. So this is the Google Trends data for the term Olympics, right? And I use the term Olympics here because this is something that you can probably relate to sort of the pattern that we see here in the Google data. So again, this is showing the number of Google searches for the word Olympics over time. Obviously, you see that there are spikes in that search term when the Olympics are actually occurring. You can notice a couple of things here. You can see that, one, the Summer Olympics seems to be on average more popular than the Winter Olympics. These arrows here in 2008, 2012, 2016 are for the Summer Olympics. The Winter Olympics are a couple of years after that. You can see that those peaks are relatively lower, right? So we can kind of get some measure of popularity here. Something else that's kind of interesting and why I chose Olympics is that in 2020, the Summer Olympics were canceled, right? They were moved, I think a year or a couple of years, or a year later in 2021. So you can see the shift in that peak, right? And so this data is sort of reflecting, again, kind of the popular, what the public is Googling, but also it is describing an aspect of our world here. So we can look at interest over time with Google Trends. You can also look at this data and look at interest over space. So these are the Google Trends data for a couple of popular fast food chains in the United States. On the top, this is the Google Trends data showing where people are Googling the fast food chain In-N-Out. And then on the bottom, it's where people are Googling the fast food chain Whataburger. You can look at a couple of things here. In-N-Out, at least from my personal, at least my personal experience, is the more sort of ubiquitous, popular fast food chain. You can kind of see that In-N-Out is Googled across the United States. It is a West Coast chain, so you can see that there's obviously a lot more Googling of that term on the West Coast in California, in Nevada, and in the Southwest. Whataburger is mostly a Southern chain. You see this reflected in the Google search history, or the Google search trends here of like Arkansas, Texas, New Mexico, etc. On average, Whataburger is I'm sure if you did a poll, is probably less popular on a country basis than In-N-Out, which is super popular. You can see there are some states where Whataburger is not Googled at all, right? So these are silly examples, but overall, it's just to show that Google Trends gives you interesting data on public interest over time and public interest over space. And so that brings me to the question of, can we use this data to see if this kind of matches up with the spread of the spotted lanternfly? Could we use this data as sort of a almost cryptic citizen science outlet of assuming, okay, if people see a spotted lanternfly, they might Google it, right? Does that match up with the distribution and the spread of the spotted lanternfly? And thus, is this kind of like a quick and dirty way that we can monitor the spread of this over time and over space? And so in our paper that was published a year ago, or a couple years ago now, we looked for, okay, we grabbed the Google search data, or the Google Trends data for the term spotted lanternfly. So we were just using the common name. We did look at the scientific name as well, but we focused on the common name because if we're sort of thinking about leveraging the public, they're probably using that common name more so than the scientific name. We gathered this data. We looked for the Google search volume of this term by different state, by year, and then also by something called the metro region by year as well. Google Trends does have some limitations in the sort of resolution that it will give you data back on. You can search by state, but you can also search at a slightly smaller scale than state called a metro region, which basically equates to medium market areas. So like handfuls of counties. So not quite down to the county level, but you can think of it as like groups of counties in US states. We looked at then select search volumes for select states by month. I will talk about this in a little bit, but Google Trends does have a lot of limitations. So we had to do sort of two separate searches, one by year, and then a slightly geographically more precise search to get a higher temporal resolution. So we looked at select states by month. You also have to look at multiple Google Trends samples and average them. Google Trends does not give you the absolute number of Google searches for a search term. There's some black box. There's lots of Google searches that happen every day. Google Trends spits out kind of a random sample that is approximating how much Google searches have been made for a given search term. So we took multiple samples and ended up averaging them. And then also the way that Google Trends gives you data back is kind of unintuitive. You have to do a number of different corrections. If you look at any publications, ours included, or others that are using this Google Trends data, there are ways that you have to correct for the overall increasing usage of the internet over the past decade or so. That's not kind of baked into the raw data that comes back. So a couple of different statistical corrections that we had to do. And then we wanted to see, okay, do those Google Trends data, do those correlate with where the spotted lanternfly actually is, right? So we got verified lanternfly occurrences through that R package that I mentioned to you previously, and also looking at actual iNaturalist observations as well. The LineMap R data gives you yearly occurrences. The iNaturalist data we aggregated monthly. Then we did a bunch of different statistical models. We did some mixed effects models, measured cross correlations, and did some seasonality tests, again, to basically ask the question, do Google searches for this insect correlate with the actual occurrence of the insect? And therefore, could you use this as kind of a proxy for where the spotted lanternfly is? So here's just a quick result. I kind of left out the statistics, but I definitely can link my paper in the chat if you want to look at kind of the nitty-gritty details. But overall, there is a significant relationship between the volume of Google searches for the term and where the spotted lanternfly actually is. So here's just a handful of maps on the left. This is the number of spotted lanternfly occurrences from that LineMap R data set. Again, sort of reflecting the spread of that spotted lanternfly over the past decade, mostly in the Northeast United States. And then the middle and the right columns are showing the Google search volumes by state in the middle, and then by those groupings of counties at a slightly smaller than state scale on the right, those metro regions. And just visually, you can kind of see that those Google search volumes are kind of spreading sort of as the actual spotted lanternfly is spreading. Again, there is a significant relationship between these two different variables. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this could be. So we wanted to follow this up. Follow this up with looking at a more precise temporal scale. So here we're looking at a couple of time series from select states up in the Northeast where we know the spotted lanternfly is. And we see that Google searches on an aggregated monthly here do closely coincide specifically with the adult stage. This kind of gives us a little bit more confidence that, okay, it's when the public is seeing those adults that they are more likely to then make a Google search for, okay, what is this thing, right? So you can kind of see some seasonality, obviously, in the actual iNaturalist observations, but also in the Google trends as well. We did some seasonality tests. These two time series seem to coincide very closely. There's not really much lag, which is kind of cool. It means that the Google search patterns that you see seem to line up with that presence of the adult here. And those are just a few select time series. Again, the adult sort of is around mid to late summer into the fall, which are those peaks you see every year in those time series on the left. Couple of limitations with this, right? So there's a correlation between when people are Googling this and where and when we know the actual spotted lanternflies are, particularly the adults. Now, the question of how good is this to actually track like the front of where this invasive species is moving? Probably not that great. You'd probably be better off looking at individual iNaturalist observations, right? Google Trends is capturing large volumes of search data from like a large public. So if one person sees the first spotted lanternfly in a new area, they might make a Google search for it, but it's kind of hard to disentangle that if you can see it at all, right? So this might be a better tool for sort of just general monitoring of where the established populations that are large enough that a majority of the public, or at least a significant portion of the public, would be actually Googling for it. So maybe not so great for initial detections and surveillance, but maybe a nice proxy to at least complement traditional monitoring using traditional methods. Couple other just general points. We got significant results here with the spotted lanternfly. However, the spotted lanternfly has received, a lot of attention. It has received a lot of media coverage. It's obviously economically important, so there's some financial incentives behind disseminating this information. It's also a relatively charismatic species as well. There's a picture of it right here on the right. Pretty interesting, pretty looking insect. So whether or not this tool would apply for maybe a species that isn't as economically important, doesn't have as many economic implications in its invasion, or maybe that is a little bit harder to discern, maybe something that's not an insect, maybe like a plant or something, right? It's kind of unknown, at least from the work that we did, how wide you could sort of spread this method to taxonomically. As I mentioned back in the methods, it unfortunately is kind of a pain in the butt to collect and work with this Google Trends data. Google Trends was originally put forward by Google as kind of just it's not really optimized for scientific research, right? Obviously, Google has all of its proprietary data that they use for the business side of things. Google Trends is giving you a snapshot into what people are Googling, but it's hard to correct for the data. There's a lot of different corrections and things you have to keep in mind about how the data is returned to you. It's not that easy to just grab and simply do an analysis with. There's a lot of sort of intermediate steps of cleaning and corrections that you have to do. That's sort of on Google's end. It also does give you limited spatial resolution. So you can look for the popularity of search terms by country, and then also by sort of subdivisions within a country. So within the United States, you can look for, again, differences in search volume by state and then also by metro region. Here in our Invasive Canada talk, if you're looking up into Canada, you can look at the patterns by the different territories, but that's about it. So depending on how the country itself is organized, and then how like media markets are organized within that country, spatial resolution is highly limited. So for example, even in the United States, I can't get down to the county level. I can only get to like groups of counties, which, isn't as informative as it could be. There's also limited temporal resolution. There's a trade-off in the public queries that you can make between what spatial resolution you're setting and what temporal resolution you're setting. Those things are going to be inversely related to one another. If I want a big spatial resolution, Google Trends will not return you an in-depth temporal resolution. So you have to end up making multiple, doing multiple samples and kind of averaging and doing a bunch of corrections in order to maximize both your spatial and temporal resolutions. So again, overall, just not really optimized for scientific research. It kind of takes a lot of work to get through all of that data. Other things, this data is off of people ultimately that are Googling for a search term, right? And this might change and vary across different demographies, right? This is going to be a function of internet access, which could be a function of overall economic wealth, could be a function of education as well. And you might have differences in education levels on average across a country or between countries, for example. And then also just general differences in awareness or engagement too, right? So this data is a function ultimately of the populations in these different locations that you're sampling. And then lastly, not to end on a overly negative note, but this whole study and this tool might be absolutely useless in the next couple of years because people might stop Googling stuff. They might just start using ChatGPT to ask the question, hey, I saw this insect with, red wings. I'm in Pennsylvania. What is this thing, right? That's data that's going to be sucked away from the Google database, right? And that will be, people are more often interfacing with ChatGPT and other AI agents. Just a couple of final notes here, right? We are not the only paper that has looked into this tool. Here are a couple of other relevant recent papers looking at using Google Trends data. So there was one that was just published this year, again, in the idea and along the vein of looking at invasive species. So looking at invasive plant species. In the upper right, this is just looking at populations, natural populations of native birds using Google Trends data. Importantly, a lot of groups have used this tool as a in sort of epidemiology of seeing, can we track the spread of, for example, not invasive species, but maybe disease or parasites or things like that. So there's one down here in the bottom left on African swine fever, and it was also used to track COVID-19 as well. So we are by no means the only group looking to use this tool. It has been used in a lot of other contexts. A couple of final points, right? Kind of going back to my big picture idea of there's a lot of different data that you can use to leverage to answer different ecology and conservation questions, including biological invasions, right? Overall, species occurrence data is super important, right? This is fundamental to many applied and theoretical fields in ecology and conservation. We have lots of new technology. Google Trends is one new data set that is relatively recent that can give us information on what is going on in our environments. But there's a lot of others as well. And then overall, again, the public is important. A lot of these data sets, and I'll end with a couple of just like other ones that we're currently working with, are reliant on a engaged public, a public that is equipped. So you can think in terms of these questions, in terms of like general wealth, access to the internet, access to a cell phone, access to computers, a public that is educated, that is educated and engaged in these topics, right? Do they know what an invasive species is? Have they heard of the spotted lanternfly? That's going to influence whether or not they even care when they see one of these. And so I'll end off with Google Trends is just one of these data sets, right? Obviously, you can use iNaturalist. That's one a lot of people are aware of. There's also species-specific citizen science platforms like PlantNet for plants. A lot of these citizen science platforms are kind of funneled through, or at least the big ones are funneled through what's called the Global Biodiversity and Information Facility, GBIF, which is a big data set that aggregates lots of specific platforms to kind of give a global occurrence data set that you can look into. Just to illustrate how there are probably emerging technologies kind of along this field as well. We're currently working, my group, with this little monitor down here. This is called Bird Weather. This debuted a couple of years ago. These are like passive monitors that you can go and buy for $100 or $200 and put it in your backyard. That passively records bird calls, right? And on the back end, you can access all of these bird calls. And so this is just, another example of emerging technologies that give you information on species occurrences and distributions that you then can leverage to answer questions, and you can leverage for conservation and policy and things like that. So that's the end of my talk. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions after we turn it back over to Chris.